good to see you. Welcome.
Yeah, but radical narrative is ongoing. It's interesting. The cool thing with radical narrative is all our guests are really busy in good ways. That's why it's so hard to narrow down an episode because, like for you, for example, you're traveling, you did your whole degree, you graduated, now you're over there in your home community working. So it's hard to set down times with like people who are actually on the
Yes.
ground doing stuff,
Yes, exactly.
which is why we do Zoom.
Yes.
Yeah. So radical
Alright.
narrative, pretty chill, pretty good flow. I really try to find these guest episodes that are unique and you fit the bill. Like I know who you are, I know the work you're doing, but I want you to introduce yourself to our guests and give a good positionality in terms of who you are, where you come from, and what do you do.
Alright. So just to begin, I like to always utilize the language as best we can. So Hamidakapi, Emery-Rose, Assiniboine, and Makiapia. I come from the Long Plain First Nation in Manitoba, as well as the Niganique Cree Nation in Southwest Saskatchewan. In terms of who I am, first off, I always want to put into the forefront that I'm a mother to two beautiful girls, and beyond that, um, I'm a partner, I'm a daughter. I don't know, this part gets really tough because we try to, in our worldview, in our Wichokha and Dakota, we try to always be real humble, right? We be humble in who we
Yeah.
are, and so this part, when we have to talk about ourselves in terms of education and background, gets really hard.
Hmm.
And sometimes, I'm still in that phase where it's like, is this who I really am? Like, do I really have all of these things? And so I'm by trade a social worker, registered in the province of Saskatchewan. And I don't know, there's a lot. There's a lot going on right now. I feel like a lot of the work that I'm doing now is centered around, I guess, helping parents, supporting parents in any which way or capacity, families that looks like. So, right now, I'm doing community work in different communities as supporting parents in how to show up as a healthy parent. And what does that look like in terms of, that piece? I guess that's me professionally. I don't know. It's so awkward.
Personally, too, about personally, one of the things we're going to talk about too is that you're doing some pretty amazing work with cradle boards.
Yes.
I identify you as an artist. You sew, you're a seamstress, you dance powwow, you do all these cool things. So you're, like I said earlier on, you're on the go. You're doing a lot of things.
Yes. And so part of that in the past 2 years, I guess we have my partner and I, and it's a whole story. So when we go into communities, we kind of share the background of how we became to share, how we became to start to share how to create cradle boards. Traditionally, like we do come from a Dakota worldview and the Dakota style of them. And so there is a whole story in that. I don't know if that's something that you wanted to quickly just go through.
Why don't you explain what a cradle board is, right? Because a lot of radical narrative listeners, a lot of them are settlers, a lot of them are coming from different Indigenous territories. We even have European listeners, interestingly enough. But yeah, what's a cradle board? And we could jump into that conversation.
Okay. So, from my understanding, when we talk about cradle boards, it's the traditional baby carrier of Dakota, Oceti Shakome people, so Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. It's based around having similar to every nation. So every nation has their own traditional baby carriers, is what we're learning just in the research that we've started in the past 2, 3 years. And you can tell which cradle boards, like I'm starting to recognize which cradle boards go to which nation. And it's starting to get to be spot on. And so they were traditionally used to help little babies, the newborn babies. I think there's babies who've been in there up to 12 months is like the oldest we've seen, but we've even seen like small 2-year-olds still in their cradle boards, and sometimes it's just up to their legs. And so they use these pieces not only to include the babies in their everyday lives, but as a form back then to help. the babies feel safe, secured, in their space. And so there's actually I was looking at, this term, I think it's like the um it's called like the moral reflex or something, and so that's
Mm,
just when babies are sleeping and you know how they twitch, like, so
yeah.
rank sometimes that they wake themselves up, and that was to eliminate that.
Mhm.
And that was to help them regulate in those times while they were sleeping in community. So they're always brought along, and that's how
Yeah.
they learned, their first sense of where they belong was through these cradle boards because historically you would see them on the sidelines, and not only would adults be checking in on them, but also the littler kids, the 7, 8-year-olds would go and sometimes have to play in front of babies so that, they learn their role in their community.
Yeah. Yeah, and developing the keen observation of observing the world, right? Not being able to crawl or interact with the world, but being patient and observing, but also like strength training, like learning strength training,
Yeah.
even patience, right? Cradleboard babies, moss bag babies tend to have they're physically stronger and they're more keen in terms of observation and more patient is how some of the old people will explain it. And also even like being able to sit still, being able to keep themselves occupied. And the work's important. It's it's really cool to see you doing the work and like for me, I was a moss bag baby. My mom tells me that I was in a moss bag for a really long time, which is a similar like structure, right? Holding a baby, keeping
Mhm.
them wrapped. My daughters both were cradle babies, like they were both in cradle boards. The
Mm.
oldest for the longer than her younger sister. The younger sister Nina wanted to get out and always held her head up and wasn't really like in there as long because she had a big sister
Yeah.
she wanted to keep up with. But yeah, it's a really important practice, and it has, like, of course, this utilitarian value where it's like, yeah, your children are taken care of. They're there, they're safe, they're secure, especially when we're mobile on the prairie traditionally. People had to work and get things done. But it's a unique practice in that even in terms of how Western modern parents view it, there's some critique of it, right? Like, they
Mhm.
critique it and they're like, "Oh, I wouldn't wrap my baby like that," or "You're tying them up," or "It's barbaric."
Mhm. Yeah, and we run into that in stories shared, with us in the workshops. There are people who said, I think, in the earlier times, like in the 50s, 60s, people would be like, that's almost harmful to do that, to tie up a baby like that. It's harmful and it's this and that. And so that kind of led me to trying to find like Indigenous First Nations resources on, how we can go and Google search
Yeah.
like gentle parenting or like what is it like
Mhm.
historically, what does that look like? And it's hard to find or to come across like Indigenous perspectives, First Nations
Yeah.
perspectives, specifically from Canada, on what did that look like? How was that
Mhm.
practice? How did you move through the time when you had to carry your cradle board or your
Yeah.
moss bag around in times when it wasn't accepted? Like, what does that look like?
It's a valid observation because one, we were in residential school in the Indian Act, right? Like I'm pretty sure radical narrative listeners know that history, and our parenting practices were impacted. And for me as like an indigenous father and having certain ties to oral history around parenting from like a Cree Dakota perspective, stories that were passed on and practices that were maintained. One of the things that bugs me with the gentle parenting conversation is a lot of it is inherently similar, but it's being constructed as new. Like it's being constructed as like this
Mhm.
is the new
Yeah.
cutting edge thing in parenting, and it bugs me when Canadians do it because it's like, weren't you guys just like involved in like decades and centuries of settler colonialism and residential schools? Like your parents and grandparents were actively participants in just terms of society maintaining a very real aggressive project on indigenous children, and now you're positioned to like this innocence of like, oh, we're parenting our children better, and it's coming at me like it rubs me the wrong way when I see it. And
Mm.
I don't really like dive into it. So that's a valid question, is where are our resources? And that's the work you're doing, right? You're informing
Mhm.
people, you're creating the resource, you are the resource, you're out there with the cradle board making workshops. And it's really cool to
Mhm.
see. And even this podcast could be a resource for people, honestly. Like we're starting to create this narrative of, hey, we know how to parent, we parented, it was impacted, and we're reclaiming it.
Yes, yes, totally. And that's kind of what, the plan and the goal is to eventually, create something in real time because, we have a lot of people now we do know are coming out to be like indigenous or, they're
Mhm.
claiming this indigenous identity and they're not actually like it's like their great grandma was, indigenous
Yeah.
and that's, their way in. But it's hard to find, the real time families actually doing that work and like
Mhm.
living, both my parents were one had gone through Indian residential school and one Indian day school. And so, being the product of these two humans, these two people that, I chose as my parents and trying to undo all of what they did and this big realization, that they literally didn't have the resources to access mental health like we do now,
Yeah.
like in today's day. They didn't have they didn't have these resources that are so available to us now. Where I had this realization probably after my second born, who is 4 now, but I had realized that I'm literally the first generation to have the resources and to be able to raise my children emotionally, right?
Yeah.
To be able to open up those spaces,
Mhm.
to be able to talk about feelings and learn how to do that. And I just think, when we're going through it with our children and trying to manage, their anger, their frustration, even their joy, it's like I'm almost having to do that with them because I've never gotten that. But I'm like in my
Yeah.
30s, right? And they're just getting this little step this little good starting point for
Yeah.
their age, to have those skills to be able to do that. And that comes back to the cradle board workshops. A lot of times, especially working with adults or teaching adults, it's where a majority of the workshop is holding space for adults in their frustration, in their self-talk to themselves, learning a new skill.
Yeah.
Sometimes we literally have to say, let's be gentle with ourselves. We have to remind them not to talk, do negative talk with themselves because it's so prominent with
Mhm.
these adult learners. And I'm just like, sometimes we've joked about it's a little bit easier because we started going into the schools and working with the grade 7 to 12, and it's easier kinda working with children because they're more open to practicing, those emotional regulation skills as opposed to adults who are, like, stuck in it
Yeah.
and just maybe they're not aware of it yet.
Yeah. Yeah, totally, and you hit the nail on the head when you said, like, some of our family systems are, like, the first generation and multiple generations back to have like this space to emotionally regulate, to parent. Like I work with teenagers and I know some family systems, and I always say this is that like some family systems and households are raising teenagers for like the first time in
Mhm.
centuries because prior to like the millennial generation, they were all in residential school. So like that's
Yes.
why there's this big focus on good child rearing, raising children, birthing practices and raising like ultimately children to teenagers. And so me
Mm.
working with teenagers, I recognize it. It's like, well, where did your mom and dad, where were they raised? And you find out, okay, well, maybe they're the first generation and this is the second generation. But then going back, it's like, oh, they were all in residential school for like the last 5 generations. Like your family didn't literally have teenagers
Yeah.
around. So like that's why a lot of communities in my mind are struggling with teenagers is because we haven't really navigated or articulated from a critical analysis that, oh, this is like a new community dynamic for us where there's a mass number of teenage population booming. And how are we meeting their needs?
Yes. And that just, like, as you were talking reminded me, so I did spend about 6 years working in, different schools on First Nations, and I had to actually step away this past year just because of that frustration, with working with alongside children and specifically, like, we have so there's a certification that I came across, and it's called, like, parent coaching. So, get to become, like, a certified parenting coach. A lot of the bones of it were really well, but there's a lot of stuff that needed to be kind of worked differently when actually utilizing it with First Nations people
Mm,
because it didn't fit into, our I guess, worldviews maybe,
Mhm.
and we're so, like I feel like we're just there's this normalization of not taking children and babies and, all these different pieces like they're human, right? Like, they just
Yeah.
kinda like, "Oh, well, they won't they don't understand," is one of the biggest ones that I've heard growing up is,
Mhm.
"They won't remember." It'll be like they'll get over it. When really, like, we're hearing from, like, Gabor Mate and the work that he's doing
Yeah.
is that, this, in utero to 8 years old, if not, if you can get them right to 25, that's the most important piece in raising children. If you can focus on connecting with your child in those formative years, like, it sets the basis for who they're gonna become, how they're gonna move through their grief, how they're gonna, be as a partner, and so all of these pieces, right? It's almost doing, like, a 180 on how we view children
Yeah.
in, like, less than 10 years ago or even 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so that piece too has been really frustrating just in trying to, um, help people understand that because it's so minimized, it's so normalized to just, they're okay, they're okay,
Mhm.
they'll be fine. But then it comes back to, like you said, working with the teenagers and that frustration piece and the issues that they have. Like, these are real things that are happening to them. And
Mhm.
it's like, how do we the frustration on, like, needing to leave the work was consistently trying like, going against that old narrative of, like, the 50 plus to 60-year-olds who are so,
Mhm.
I felt like they weren't open. They weren't open to hearing, they weren't open to learning a different way of thinking was
Mhm.
the struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is an ongoing struggle because and maybe this is gonna turn into, like, a millennial conversation, but we are dealing with, like, this older population and like, many of them still speak the language, have cultural teachings, adhere to our ways of life and worldview. However, at the same time, like, they're residential school survivors, so the drama, trauma, toxicity does sort of permeate that generation where you're right, where it's like they're not open to, the hardcore conversations or the deeper conversations around parenting and raising children in a good way, in a healthy way, because yeah, you often hear them say, children are resilient or they adapt. But when you're looking at like even Western child psychology and things that child psychology and brain development's uncovering, it's like no, like our old people in terms of how they viewed parenting were correct, but there's like this generation gap now where it's like we have to relearn these and apply these. Like the big one that pissed me off was when I was in college, and I was in college for like ever, right? And university.
Yeah.
And I couldn't afford a bed frame. And I just got a box spring and a mattress and I threw it on the floor and me and my girl's mom at the time, we were fine with that. We were happy with that, and you'd see memes, people saying like, "Oh, some people don't even own a bed frame, get your life together," stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I remember when we moved and we found out we were gonna have our oldest, I was like, "Well, I'm gonna buy like a bed frame," and I ordered a bed frame from a company online, and that came in the mail, set it all up, and then I started to look into parenting stuff, right? And then all of a sudden, I'm looking at like I don't know if it was Montessori or just like parenting
Yeah.
style, but they're all of a sudden saying, "Put your bed on the floor." And I was like, "What the fuck?" Like, yeah, that's how we've always slept as a people, but now you're like I kinda just did this whole, like, journey of, like, I'm getting my shit together, I'm gonna buy a bed frame, right? And then now
Yeah.
it's like
Yes.
the Western world of parenting is like, "No, you gotta put your bed on the floor, you gotta do things this way," and I'm like, "Well, that's how we always did things," and now it's like you're applying that like, to us or, like, applying that as, like, this cutting edge thing, and when we knew that, and then society moved away from that, and now it's like this Montessori approach, this gentle parenting approach being led by like non-indigenous people that are like trying to have these conversations. But for me, it's like, well, going back to our traditional teachings, yeah, we did sleep on the ground. Yeah, we did co-sleep. Yeah, we did set up our house in a way where there was a routine. Like even traditionally, our lodge was always set up the same way when we would even traverse like miles on the prairie. When we put it up, it would be
Mhm.
up in the same way, right? So the child would wake up in the same household, even though they traversed the landscape. So all this stuff is like it makes sense when you look at the oral history and you connect these dots. And then yeah, it's like we have to go back to these fundamental conversations of raising good, healthy, strong children again because yeah, it's like they're literally they're going to be like carrying the nation forward, right?
Yes, yes, exactly, and that too in itself, like, just speaking from my own experience and trying to do my best to output that in real time, right?
Mhm.
Like, so from our teachings, one of the things that we wanted to practice, as being, new parents with our oldest, so she's 7 now, was being mindful. We wanted to be mindful of who she was around in her first 2 years of life,
Yeah.
so what was shared with us was that in that and we you guys probably have and Nehia was probably similar in, honoring their soft spot, right? And
Mhm.
so in our way, in Dakota way too, it's taught that in their first 2 years of life, that's why, you dress them up the best, you give them like, you just adorn them in
Mhm.
who they are and treat them as such because they're still deciding, whether they're gonna stay here or if they're gonna go back in that 2 years is what was shared with us. And so even just in that own practice, we were super mindful, of who was around our baby, who got to carry our baby, and it was met with resistance from our
Mhm.
own families, and having to do that education piece. Now, 7 years later, they're so different, they're more open,
Yeah.
but it took that growth piece of, there's stuff coming up for them,
Mhm.
and they, specifically with my mom, so she is her and I, since I had my firstborn, we've been really working on our relationship. We're
Mhm.
20 years apart, and so it's been it's been a good challenge.
Mhm.
There's challenge and growth, and we're so different than we were just, at 7, 8 years ago. And a lot of it comes down to her own issues in the way she was raised and seeing, my kushi raise her and even the dynamics of my kushi and me. She had actually shared a story just this past week on my kushi's practice of creating a moss bag for me in the best way she knew how. So again,
Mm.
like she spent her first 12 plus years in Indian residential school.
Mhm.
And so when she came out, she had the language and she had a little bit of, what was practiced traditionally and ceremonially. And she did her best to pass those on to her children and her grandchildren. And it was very little, but it was also a lot more than, what we have in our community.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, she had made my moss bag in the best way she knew how, and it actually has, like and we have 4 main cradle boards that we take around
Mhm.
that all kinda share a story of how the work got started,
Yeah.
and it's kinda based around her, it's based around the first moss bag that she had made for me, and what that looked like generationally because I've seen it personally on about 10 different babies, including my siblings and a
Mhm.
few of my younger cousins, and so that in itself, we talk about as being, like, that generational love, like, I don't know if she ever thought that, this same moss bag would see my kids, and this moss bag is probably gonna see my kids', right?
Mm. Yeah.
And so that kinda ties into that, it's like reclaiming and trying our best, like what you had mentioned about, the bed situation. It's like we had all this stuff, and then they took it from us, including the language,
Mhm.
and then actually, never mind, here you go. So we're, like, in this, like, "Well, what do we do then?"
Yeah.
And for me, at a personal level, it's like I'm just doing what feels right,
Mhm.
what feels like what I feel called to, and that goes back to these cradle boards, in going out to share. It was a calling for a while before we actually went out, and I had to do a lot of the work, the emotional work of feeling like I could be there, feeling like I could be sharing it. I still fight with this sometimes in
Mhm.
going out into different communities is that I don't feel like I know enough. I don't feel like I'm
Mm.
old enough. I don't feel like I should be doing this. I don't feel like and so a lot of times what gets me through those pieces, those moments is we have went to the people that we trust that we utilize in their feedback and how we should be doing this and always trying to remember to do it in a good way and
Mhm.
to show up and be in the work in a healthy way in a good relative way because I feel like they're an energy of their own and it's not mine to keep and to be like, well, and a lot of times we go into communities and I ask, is there any moss bag makers or cradle board makers in your community? And sometimes they'll name a few,
Hmm.
but a lot of times they always say, but they only make them for their family, right? They're only
Hmm.
their family,
Yeah.
which is which is beautiful, and I get that, but I also, being in the area of social work, I think of, like, these younger people coming out of the
Yeah.
system, and they
Yeah.
literally sometimes don't know where to go to access, like, getting their Indian name or wanting to go to ceremony. They don't know where to go,
Yeah.
especially in my community. I feel like we're just starting, the groundwork for reconnecting back to culture, back to language. And it can get pretty hopeless sometimes. Sometimes it can get pretty hopeless, but then you see these little glimmers of people
Yeah.
showing up and genuinely, growing. And it might be one or two people, but that's, more than we had
Hmm.
even a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. You're really painting this picture of the work you're doing and the communities you're navigating and how you're navigating it to do the work you want to do. And I do agree, like there is my heart goes out to people who work in our frontline communities all the time, but especially the ones that work with children and young people and the way they need to be worked with, like doing the work that really matters and counts. Because there's a lot of people running on a hamster wheel, CFS approach or,
Yeah.
clinical, like set up an appointment with me approach. But when people are actually engaged in community and you're painting this picture, there's a lot more that shows up in terms of like the consciousness of the community, how you navigate it, like the needs of the people and where we're at collectively. And it's hard to explain because I was just doing a training last week in Edmonton and one of the participants from Morley, Alberta, we were talking about like this concept of like, networking and being in community and mapping community and seeing it. And she said something really unique where she said, it's really hard to explain, but when you're in community and you're there, and you see it, you know it. Like, you have to be there to connect the dots and be immersed
Mhm.
in, like, the collective consciousness of a community to be able to navigate it, right? And to learn from it and be open to adjusting and for me, like, I call that, like, a home fire, like, that's literally the collective home fire of so much of our
Mhm.
communities of where we're at, which is a big controversial thing to say because you did say it too, where, there is a population of children in care that will be coming home to our communities, and for me, like, I really wanna offer a safe place for them to come to and be a good resource to welcome, children and people home who have questions. However, on top of that, like, you mentioned it earlier too in the early part of us talking where there are, like, pretendians out there, and there are people who, like, for whatever reason in their family history became like a descendian and are like and speaking on behalf of communities and or even like making things up politically, historically, and culturally that aren't even true that are taking up so much space. Like they're taking up so
Mhm.
much space. Like I just saw this big influencer online where a lot of people are sharing her content get called out by the community she claims because she exposed herself with getting a lot of things wrong and people knew it was a problem for a while. And looking back at her TikTok, she was doing like cultural interpretation, like, like even spiritual interpretation, political interpretation that was really problematic. And there's so much layers to this, right? Because even it highlighted too,
Yes.
like how like on top of language learning, right? On top of like learning our language, we're doing this work and navigating these things that exist like like we have to have a panoramic view of everything taking place, right? So it's not
Yes.
just cradle boards, it's like everything else that comes with it in terms of like how we're navigating the times we're living in.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And then yeah. So there's just so much layers, and then, we talk about being parents, in real time, working through all of this, but also one of the biggest realizations in all of this is, the normalization of, like, disconnection from the get-go, right? Like,
Mm,
the mothers need to get back to work. You have so
yeah.
many you have so many months to just be with baby, and then you gotta get back to work. And so the goal was never to be this 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and that's one of the things that, I share when I enter, employment with people is that I'm gonna choose my children over this job at any point in time. I'll be okay, right? And that was always the goal is to become educated enough to to spend the majority of time like being home, because what I realized is tomorrow, and even with you and your daughters, like tomorrow they're gonna be
Mhm.
a day older every
Yeah.
day. And we don't get that time back. We don't get to, redo their parenting. We don't get to parent
Yeah.
them again. This is our one chance with each child that we have. And that's been the drive to do specifically these cradle board workshops because we bring them along.
Mhm.
We bring them along in it in hopes that we don't I don't know what the outcome of them coming along, of being home more, of helping them, to the best of my ability. It's never perfect. There's good days and bad days with that as well, in holding space for them emotionally. And I don't know what the outcome is gonna be. I
Mhm.
don't know what they're gonna look like. And I do, go through that as well in my mind. And so with my partner as well, it is a whole other concept. And so yeah, there's so many layers to this, but I also think that the most important I mean, for me, I guess the most important investment is my children and the
Yeah.
connection that I have with them. And the goal for me has always been, when they're adults living their own lives, is that they still want me to be a part of it,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And that just that for that, that piece in itself is like, well, then I need to show them. I don't even know. Like I don't really know. I'm just doing my best guess
Mhm.
here, but like, if you want someone to be a part of your life, then it needs to be reciprocal, right? And
Mm.
even in your mistakes. And that's what, working with parents, and specifically around like healthy parenting, it's like it's not about never making mistakes. It's not about being perfect all the time. The biggest thing that we have to remember is that repair piece. And I ask that in the group works that I do, is like, how many of us have been apologized to when our parents, either scared us or, put us in a bad position, or we witnessed something at, their expense. How many of us were apologized to in that
Mhm.
moment, or a couple days after, or a week later? A lot of times, I think there was like one or two in the group works that I've done that have said, I have, but later as an adult.
Mhm.
And so that in itself is like, even my own journey, I don't remember being apologized to until recently.
Mhm.
Like I said, the work with my mom, she started apologizing for certain things. And so it's like, how do we, I don't know. Some days I don't even know.
Yeah, it makes sense what you're saying, and yeah, it's tough for like the older generation to come to terms with mistakes they made, and working with families too. I know family systems are doing their best to reclaim, a sense of identity, culture, tradition, and safety, and that apology part is really important. Like it shows up on people's healing journeys, right? You'll often hear like the keynote speaker or somebody talk about the importance of forgiveness and in their family systems and being mindful of that. And then you also highlighted too, like one thing that I'm glad you said it on the podcast is that I interpret it as like a critique of capitalism, where it's like we're expected to abandon our children for the sake of capitalism, for the sake of like jobs, careers, and positions that in my mind do compromise our traditional indigenous relationship to parenting and our children, right? And I see that working with children because I know some children have more strong relationships with their teachers at school than they do with their household.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because it's like, well, as indigenous kinships and communities, how do we come to implement those family practices and kinships in a healthy way where we are addressing the problems and fallout of capitalism. But then at the same time, it ties back into this element of forgiveness because flash forward to when they're teenagers, a lot of them leave home because there was no forgiveness, because it was like toxic or trauma and drama or, family breakdown. I'm actually working with some teenagers who don't like the career choices their parents made because it did come at the cost of them having a relationship with their parents. And for me, I'm
Yes.
really mindful of that because it's like we are in this like entrepreneurship, like neoliberal federal government putting scholarship money out there for people to get careers. but at what
Mhm.
cost, right? And so this all intertwines into like how do we reinvigorate and establish indigenous family systems rooted in safety, rooted in love and compassion and kinship for our communities, families, and territories, while at the same time recognizing that, hey, there's an ongoing pattern of toxicity, drama. We're not even talking about like addictions in some family systems. We're just simply just talking about like the modernity of the expectations of society for us to perform and maintain like the economic political structure of ultimately Canada. So it does even get political in this sense, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes, exactly, and, like, the dream, guys, is that, we heal and deal and feel through what we need to in order to be able to be in spaces of our families, and, the hope is that with my own children is that we, collectively come together so that we're able to we don't have to rely on that 9 to 5
Yeah.
in order to survive in society because we do need money. We have, like,
Mhm.
car payments, we have all these different things that we have, to pay, and so, like, collectively, you think of, like, even, like, a mortgage or rent, like, it would come drastically down if we were able to collectively work together
Yeah.
in that.
Yeah.
But I even think of it's just my own mom and siblings, like, right now, like, just not for it because of our
Mm-mm.
own issues that we still need to heal and deal through and
Yeah.
talk about and connect with, and I think a lot of that too comes down to learning how to communicate, and you like you mentioned working with families, a lot of it sometimes came down to literally holding space, being, like, almost like a moderator for this conversation that needed to happen when
Mm-mm.
working with families that could have happened without me, right? Like,
Yeah.
I didn't need to be there, but they still they needed that piece of literally, "How does this go? What questions need to be asked?" And working with young people, sometimes it was holding that conversation for a young person
Mhm.
to share some harder news or to be real and to share use their voice for certain things with their caregiver,
Yeah.
and that wouldn't have happened if there wasn't another adult there to kind of hold that space in that way, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, and like for me too, like this is like a family systems approach, right? Like if we were talking about like therapeutic model, and it exists
Yeah.
in like Western therapy models and things like that. But it's pretty fundamental to who we are as a people in terms of being able to connect and maintain these healthy kinships and relationships and doing the work that's needed because ironically, or well, interestingly enough, another Western therapeutic model is like highly individualistic, like clinical therapy. Like I had Sonia Ahmed on a few episodes ago where like, Western therapeutic model doesn't account for, in some cases, kinship or, like cultural
Mhm.
obligations to family, community, and land. And they sort of have this undertone of like in some cases, even in extreme cases, like toxic positivity, like go out and live your life, go out and do
Yeah.
what you're doing. And that's so like predicated on the fact that in modern society, people could live individual lives. Like they could afford a job, they could move wherever they want in the world. But for Indigenous people, traditionally and historically, we were collective and our family systems were
Mhm.
so important, right? So it's interesting to hear like in this conversation that family systems are important and we're working to strive and maintain that through the various modalities, approaches, and things like that. But again, at the same time, we are like in this capitalistic, like individualistic approach that doesn't really sit well with me, um, or radical narrative. That's why I get these guests that really promote and advocate for like native family systems or indigenous governance and nationhood, because it is a collective approach. It is fundamentally tied to who we are.
Yes, yes. And I hope that, 7 generations later that we get back to that.
Yeah.
And I always tell people when working in community, like, if our nations ever decided to all work together and collectively, like, they could do some
Yeah.
incredible things, but
Yeah. One
that's
of
a whole
my
other topic.
it is. Like one of the people I look up to said that if we had the right resources, we could give like we could give our people all our, like he implied it politically, but he said we could give Canada to our people on a golden plate. Like if we collectively organized and
Mhm.
structured our nations, like we would be able to like dominate in a good way, like politically, economically, the landscape. And it boils down to like healthy families, right? Because healthy
Yes.
families make a healthy nation. And we had that practice as a people, right?
Yes.
Prior to contact, prior to colonialism, and we're striving to do that. And that way, like I think like a lot of my listeners who are inherently political or leftists will be like, astounded to hear that, for us, our core nationhood governance system does tie to the health of a family, to maintaining it,
Yeah.
maintaining the home fire, the safety, the presence of it, right?
Mhm. Yes, and that's such a great way to look at it because you think of you think how different our, leaderships could have been had they, had something like who knows? We don't know who is Alma's big babies. We don't know who was in a
Mhm.
cradle board, who followed that way, but I'm sure the ones who are choosing to be unhealthy, might it would be a cool study to be like, "Were you in a mosque?" And,
Yeah.
"No, no, 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 no." And then the ones who are doing like, there are some communities who
Yeah.
are doing amazing work, like, they're just doing it while they're in there, and, like, one of them being hearing just I talked about Kihiwan Cree Nation's birthing camp, so they
Mhm.
have, like, a midwifery revitalization project going on right now, but even that in itself, that they talked about the struggles, they talked about the pushback, they talk about where it's been, I think, 5 years the camp has been there,
Mhm.
and so that in itself is, like, how much they have grown, but also who knows, like, what this is doing for the generations to come as
Yeah,
well.
definitely. Yeah.
I will just quickly give mention to the camp in itself because
Yeah.
we had one of, TJ's aunties be there, and she must, I don't know, she's getting up there in age, I wanna say, late 50s, early 60s, but even with her, like, she's, like, said, "I've never made, a cradle board," and we always joke about because one of our daughters is registered there, and
Mhm.
somebody from Sioux Valley has children out there as well, and I'm like, so they're from the same area, and we always joke about Kihiwan starting their own little, like, Dakota nation within their nation,
Oh,
so we
yeah,
have to
yeah.
start learning more Dakota, worldviews and traditions, but they too have said, like, they had theirs at one time,
Mhm.
similar to, like, the Ojibwe Anishinaabe style, which
Yeah.
is, like, the moss bag tied to the backboard.
Mhm.
Um, so they had theirs, and it's like I feel like for my own self, like nobody is, kinda stepping up to share in that way to continue on, I guess, the work in terms of, like, I don't even know who I would ask. I think Teresa
Mhm.
Campio,
Mhm.
so she has made the moss bag wood style that she had learned. Another shout out I like to give is, Dr. Elena Eagleshield and her partner. So they also do Dakota style or Ocheti Shikoin style cradle boards in the States predominantly. But she had actually done her PhD on like the revitalization of cradle boards and what it instills. And so they actually started doing workshops, I want to say like 2 years before we started.
Mm.
And like they've been so helpful to help us learn as well, which I think is always amazing because there's so many like I feel like there's so many artists trying to like be up and like not be open to sharing or
Yeah.
encouraging other artists to, utilize their skill in a good way. And so I always like to give shout outs to them. But also another one who we share in our workshop is Marissa Mitsuing or Moxon Mitsuing, who really brought the cradle boards to the forefront in terms of powwow back in 2023, 2022. She had her cradle board special, and honestly, like, even in that, you talk to anybody who was there, the energy of the powwow was just different in that space, and
Mhm.
I think, if you ever get a chance to hear that her story on how, she came to output this special, it's so beautiful, and, I feel like there's people who are just genuinely called to step up and do this, and, that was kinda how this was born on
Mhm.
sharing and learning how to make them because we didn't know how. We didn't know who to ask. We had family, and I'm like, "Who do we like, I wanna make a cradle board for this special," but we didn't know how. And
Mhm.
so we literally I took off upstairs. TJ went down to the garage, and she took care of the woodwork. I took care of the fabric
Mhm.
piece, and then our last piece was literally coming together and, like, putting the cradle board attaching them together. And so we made our first one. And then from there, people wanted to order and then they wanted workshops and then this and this.
Mhm.
And I'm like, who even is like, do we have the right?
Yeah.
Like, just trying to make sure that we do it in a good way. But, I always just say that, it's kind of like this work has kind of grown on its own. It's like I literally just am kind of guiding it to where it needs to go in that because we go out to different communities and sometimes it's so effortless to come into a community and sometimes it just doesn't work for others who really want it to go there. And
Yeah.
so like I really feel like this is just something that I'm carrying around to I guess well me and my family are carrying around to where it needs to go.
Yeah.
So we're not like choosy, we're not
Mhm.
forceful, like, hey, come take this cradle board workshop into your community. I feel like it's just been on it. It's just grown into its own.
That's good.
And and now people are asking for the teachings behind it,
Mhm.
which we haven't really sat down with anybody yet,
Mhm.
other than just conversations in workshops that we've been learning a little bit at a time
Mhm.
on what the teachings are behind it. But I hope to, connect to people who are willing to share and help us learn in that way.
Yeah, that's a cool story, and the shout outs are important too, and I wanna give some shout outs too to some people who make cradle boards and even moss bags locally. Yeah, and I like that genealogy because I do remember the special, right? The special of Marissa Moccasin having the special with the cradle boards, and it was cool to see, and there was this big shift at that time, like, I do remember seeing that and experiencing that. And it was cool to hear how teamwork makes the dream work with you and TJ coming together to do the cradle boards and where you're taking it today. Because I do agree, like the work goes where it's needed, right? Like I'm really mindful of like people who push themselves into spaces or push themselves into doing this like emotional, like even cultural consciousness work. Because
Mhm.
like for me, I don't market my work personally. It shows up or it comes to me through references.
Yes.
And it's and sure, there's dry spells, but it's also like it shows up when it needs to, and it's cool to hear how you're applying that to this approach as how it's unfolding naturally. And then you highlighted something cool too, where it's like, yeah, there are people out there who have the know-how and the knowledge and are willing to share, but then at the same time, some people are keeping it within family systems or within, their immediate bases and places they live and operate. And then also just recognizing the fact that it was family systems that maintained a lot of this, right? So if someone doesn't have
Yeah.
access to it or the practice of it or the community or even labor or support to do these things, it'll be very challenging. It'll be very challenging.
Yes. Yes, which brings it back to like we talk about intergenerational trauma and all of that comes with like all of that. I also am starting really to believe in that, we have an intergenerational knowledge as well. And I think that
Yeah.
that's kind of where this came from cuz sometimes, we think about it and I could see it in my mind. I could see the how to put it together in my mind, but to have someone like you to explain and to share like to try and get what I see in my mind into your mind
Mhm.
would take a lot to, like, just talk about, right? And
Yeah.
so, sometimes it is really like, you have to connect into that space,
Mhm.
especially as an artist. Sometimes
Yeah.
people think, like, they want, like, "Oh, I want this ribbon skirt, and I want it green, and I want this on it." Okay.
Mhm.
Well, a lot of times it's the getting it in your mind and getting what you see, what you want, like, that takes the longest, and so that goes back to these cradle board pieces is that I do think sometimes it is guided by like intergenerational knowledge
Mm.
because I don't know where it comes from. I don't know how I know. I just
Yeah.
this is just what comes out. And so I think that that piece is really real now. Just being able to say, I don't know where I learned how to do this. It
Yeah.
just, came, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's relatable too because even me with archery and I'm making like lances and spears now,
Yeah, I saw that.
you kinda don't get like you have to be in it and go through the motions of doing something. I got a anthropologist buddy that's gonna jump on. He's native, and he's gonna jump on the podcast because he does like a lot of experimental archaeology. And his insight with like remaking, doing flint knapping, looking at sites of going through the motions our ancestors went through like, putting your body and your effort into doing those things, it does, in my mind, and even in our conversations,
Mhm.
like, unlock the memory of it, but also, like, gives us the appreciation of, "Man, our people were doing this." Like, we were out there doing
Yeah.
this without modern technology, so to speak, and out on the land and had the kinship strong enough to maintain these things. Like, we're gonna do it interestingly enough, without being a spoiler alert, we're gonna do a episode on cooking, how we collectively cooked as a people.
Mhm.
And in that practice is like, man, like teamwork does make the dream work. You need a family system to live in our traditional territory back in the day. If you didn't have
Yeah.
it, then well, that's so like foreign, right? Like it's such a foreign concept. It doesn't even translate of being an individual within our like family life cycles.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that,
Even in the language, it's not
yeah, it doesn't exist.
individualistic.
Which brings me to like I wanted to say too on this podcast with you. It's which is why like even single parenting today is like an outlier in our history. Like
Yeah.
there's more single parents today than there ever was traditionally in our collective history as Indigenous people.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back because I like what you said about how, like, we're leadership in moss bags, like, who's a moss bag baby? It's it's like, it's such a valid
It would be a
observation,
cool one.
like a research. I honestly like, for me, like, being, having people who are in social work and do, like, social work as a academic discipline, I always say, like, we need to create our own data, do our own surveys, like, ask those types of questions that we could refer to. Because people don't realize like Gabor Mate's work is like based off his clinical approach and research over like the last what 30, 40 years or something. So our people need to like record those things and ask those questions and do surveys. You should survey your workshops and just
I should.
start collecting data because you could
I
refer to it
should.
later. And there's even like old people like cookums out there and they say they could tell who's a moss bag baby and who's not.
Yeah.
Which I agree with. Like I feel like there could be like a wisdom assessment just by observation.
Yeah. And they have to assess leadership before they get in. No, just kidding.
Yeah, something like that, right? And that should be and that it's a valid metric, like, our children are wrapped in moss bags. I don't wanna say, like, specific teachings on the air because, like,
Yeah.
some, like, I don't know, new agey pretending will try and create a workshop or something or create a TikTok reel and make money off it. But, yeah, like, there's very real reasons why we do these things, and they do have, like, these outcomes that we require as a people to maintain, like, strong, resilient children that grow up into being adults.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, now they're starting because now, like, there's this new agey, like, swaddling, right? Like, there's
Mhm.
literal swaddle blankets where you don't have to know how to wrap traditionally, but they do the same thing. And, like, they're now I think it was 2019, I don't even know the name of the guy, but he had started, like, looking at, like, brain scans of babies being
Mhm.
swaddled, and, like, they're seeing that, there's more, um, synapses happening when they are swaddled as opposed to being not swaddled just because they don't sleep as long if they're not swaddled, so then they're, like, hardly having, brain growth development happening because that's just babies just have that twitch that happens
Yeah.
that just wakes them up, and I wanna share a story
Mhm.
with our one of our groups that recently, like, probably a few months ago, we went in and we had a new mom there, and she was saying, "Baby doesn't sleep more than 15 minutes. She just wants to be on me." Like, that's just and so she was making a cradle board. She asked if we could help her because she didn't have anybody to watch her baby, and so we agreed to help her. And so she came, she showed up every day, like, she was there from the start to the end every day, and so I did my best to help her in that, and TJ actually so TJ, she was raised with 2 sisters, and each sister has 5 children, so she got a good amount of learning, prior
Mhm.
to having children with me where I'm the oldest, and my girls are literal 2 only 2 grandchildren right now, and so we have this dynamic of being complete opposite. And so anyway, so TJ had asked the young mom, "Can I wrap your baby?" And the mom says yes. And so she did this whole teaching with everybody, and there was, young people, old people, who were in there, and she wrapped baby, and baby slept for like an hour and a
Oh,
half or
okay.
almost 2 hours. And the mom was like, "Oh my God, like what?" She kept checking on her. And And so even in that, in our workshops, we're noticing, like, babies are in this area, we've been in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan where babies aren't being wrapped as much,
Mhm.
or we aren't seeing them being wrapped as much. And so, yeah, she had a good sleep, and then, mom wanted to know how to wrap baby. And so just that in itself, you talked about, like, collectively, helping people in these spaces in a modern way. We don't know what this is gonna look like for her.
Yeah.
I don't know if she learned how. I don't know, like, there's that, like you said, like, that research we're not following up with
Mm.
the babies who are going into the cradle board right after the workshop sometimes, or,
Yeah.
their babies are going into their cradle boards,
Mhm.
and one thing that they, are always saying is that they sleep long, they sleep longer. They're
Yeah.
taking their, those naps, and which would make sense as to why there's more brain, growth happening
Yeah.
than not being wrapped or hardly being wrapped.
Yeah. Yeah, valid. Like sleep's so important for cognitive development, right? So if wrapping them and co-sleeping or even using like our traditional swing like helps with that, then like more the merrier. Like do it.
Yes,
Like we
yes,
have
of
to do
course.
these things. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back and ask you a question too because you touched on it and I wanted to get a good like understanding for our listeners about this. But one of the things you said, and I know you even brought up like Gabor Mate and things like that, and I'm familiar with his work. I tell people to read his work, but I also say he's not indigenous, right? There's some gaps in
Yeah.
in his stuff, and I sometimes even now wonder if people really read his work or if they just like reference it, right? Because like some of his core thing, like he talks about like peer groups raising peer groups, and it's like
Yeah.
people make reference to it, and it's like, are we really like fundamentally applying what he's talking about, or do we just like what he's saying, right? Because
Yeah.
I took this book really seriously. Like I took holding on to your children really seriously, and I practice that. Like my daughters are
Yes.
with me; they're always with me, right? And we homeschool them the best we can. But you said that traditional parenting practices differ from mainstream Western approaches, like to child rearing and raising children. Like, what are some of those differences, and how do we contrast them? Because we're kind of like we're talking around it a bit, right? But I want to really like paint a good, clear picture on that. I got one, just a little, just to get the conversation going, because you see it all the time. Is like our children always had their head covered, like constantly, historically, and then you see like non-indigenous parents not necessarily cover their children's head, or have a toque on or something in the winter.
Oh, yeah, yes. Yes, yes, yes. That's a
Yeah.
good one. That's a good one because this same group that I talked about with wrapping baby was the same group we talked about. And this is just conversations that we had just
Hmm.
making our cradle boards, like you said, like there's this connection piece that happens. But they had asked about that. Were our babies bonnet babies? And
Hmm.
I said, actually, yeah, they were. And, doing that realization that, like, we have a 4-year old, she still wears bonnets.
Hmm.
Our 7-year old just, I feel like she just got out of bonnets, but
Hmm.
and we're looking back at it and they asked, like, well, how were they with, like, ear infections? And I'm like, they had no ear infections. And I said, and I didn't know why we had to
Mm.
continuously have bonnets on our baby's head. We just did it
Yeah.
because going out, we'd get scolded, right?
Yeah.
Cover her head, especially from the old
Yeah.
ladies. They'd be
Yeah.
like, cover her head, cover their head.
Yeah.
And so we did it without questioning as to why. But now looking back, they none of them had ear infections,
Yeah.
which is kinda common in with working with babies is that they get ear infections.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I switched to toques. Like they were bonnet babies, and we had bonnets, and then I just switched to toques. We always have toques on, or a
yes.
buff on now, so they look a bit cooler now. But
Yeah, I know.
because people assume bonnets are Western, right? Because they did sort of take like this little settler look, right? Like
Yeah.
they have the
Yeah.
doily, we wrap them. But honestly feel like we literally probably just saw that as a people and said, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna make one for my baby," and keep their
Yeah, and
head
I
covered.
think so, and then, like, the thing though, like, parenting real time, I like toques too, I like the button-up ones, but,
Hmm.
like, it's hard to find kinds that, like, they're okay with keeping on, and so bonnets, when they're made properly, and that was
Yeah.
my issue, was that I'd buy, like, a ton of bonnets off people, but the
Hmm.
babies don't like the way they fit, and so if they
Yeah.
don't like the way they fit, they're gonna not wear them, it's gonna be
Yeah.
fussy, and so finding those ones that are, like,
True.
almost like the helmet style, right? So
Yeah.
that they just stay on and they could see, and so when they look one way, their bonnet looks with them as opposed to, like, looking, and then
Yeah.
their bonnet stays facing straight, and they're like
Yeah.
they get all fussy, but I guess that would be one way. I know a lot of times too, just doing work with people is being open to children being in our spaces is a big one,
Mm. Yeah.
and being okay with, like, the, emotions that come along with children as well. Sometimes there are times, in our workshops where I just let the parents know, like, "It's okay if
Mhm.
baby's, like, being fussy or they're crying, like, that's normal. I'm not gonna be, getting mad or upset about it, just to
Yeah.
let you know," right? And sometimes that goes such a long way in feeling like they're welcomed into the space because I too specifically, like, raising my children, but specifically in ceremony spaces, I'm like, I didn't feel welcomed. Even now with the cradle, like we talked about the cradle board special, there are times when I wore my cradle board gear, my cradle board pow stuff in something as simple as grand entry or, like, exhibition, and there's so much fear in
Yeah.
stepping out there, in being called out, being told to leave, like, and I'm like, why does it feel this way from others? Like, this
Mhm.
should be, like, the safest space. Why do I feel so much fear in wearing this cradle board in powwow, in the arena? Why is it that way? And so
Mm.
that was kind of a big realization. I hardly do that, but there's times when I intentionally want to go and to see the feels of it. And you'll
Yeah.
you'll know um in terms of feeling like where you're safe, where you're not safe, like
Yeah.
especially yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I know like collectively communities and like people from their home fires have to navigate and have those conversations as to why. Like why do some of these questions and conversations come up? Like for me, I'm now of the sound mind where like Indigenous governance doesn't take place on Facebook. It doesn't take place on social media. It happens where the collectives are. And I see like a lot of commentary and critique coming up on social media, and that's not the space for it in my mind, ironically, because I
Mhm.
have a
Yeah.
podcast. But at the same time, it's like there's layers to this. So like I feel like these big conversations are so important because I even encounter that as a father, right? When I have my daughters by myself and me and their mom co-parent, but when I'm with my daughters by myself, like the assumptions people have of me being like an incapable father, unsolicited feedback, or even judgment
Yeah.
I honestly don't feel safe in some of our communities where our people are, like, in some of the spaces where they are as a single father because, yeah, like, it's a sense of judgment or I shouldn't, be watching my girls or some people will assume I'm babysitting, like, where's their mom, you know? And
Yeah.
it's, like, very volatile, and I honestly, like, I say it when I talk about parenting and family systems where, some of the harshest criticisms of my fatherhood came from my own people. Like, came from
Mm.
from, my like, people who are Indigenous and having to hold space and even, like, to certain extents, defend my relationship to my fatherhood and my daughters had to be very mindful. I'm very mindful of it, of
Yeah.
how I present myself as a father and protect my role as a father. Because, yeah, like, there's even some times where people will just come up and even try to take my girls and be like, "Oh, go do what you gotta do. I'll watch them for you and stuff." But it's like, "No, I'm a parent. Like,
Yeah.
like, this is my job." But I do rely on the kinship systems and they're available, like my mom, my sister, my brother. But at the same time, it's a very, like, close, tight-knit circle of who I'm utilizing. Like, no one's raising my daughters other than their parents, which I think is,
Yes.
like, the role and responsibility of parenthood. Like, the rites of passage of becoming a parent is you're a parent, right? You can't, like, offload that. You're
Yeah.
obligated to that, and, it's interesting because like, these conversations could get tense. There's a lot of judgment. I even know that even, like, dark humor around, Marissa Moccason's experience with her special, like, people
Yeah.
even, saying some pretty harsh jokes, which definitely wasn't appropriate. But at the same time, like, the patriarchy and the Western influence and damage of residential school really has a lot of our people not even having, like not even being in a space to hold conversations around parenting, the roles of fathers, the roles of mothers, the roles of parents in general that are healthy. And that's
Yeah.
what we need to shift as a people is we need to have these conversations in spaces where they matter. Find out what works and what doesn't work and invest time in what is working.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And that's, hopefully one day that we get those pieces. Like you
Yeah.
said, we're gonna we're gonna be the ones kinda doing that work, and I always joke with TJ, like, I'm so curious to, the end results of, like, the work that you're doing, and there's so many others who are doing, similar work in trying something different with their children, but, like, I'm curious to see, like, when we're old and how our children are gonna be and,
Yeah.
what the outcome is of all this, right? Of all this investment in them, and yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know. I really don't know.
That's the struggle, right? It's because we're like it we will be sitting there in like 20, 30 years with hindsight clarity of what worked and didn't work, and we really don't know until we get there. So it's
Yeah.
like we're investing time and effort into these concepts, approaches that are guided by like our ancestral teachings, right?
Yeah.
And trying to find that way forward, and I always tell people, like, as long as we're mindfully navigating, like, that's the point, right? Like, to have the
Mhm.
conversations, to be mindful. If it doesn't feel right, it probably doesn't feel right, you know? It's like, there's a reason
Yeah.
why, and if it does feel right, then there's probably leaning towards that as, "Why does this feel right?" Because for me, like, as a father, like, there's things that I'm doing with my daughters that are very, like, culturally important to me, and I'm not gonna compromise on that. Like,
Mhm.
no one's gonna remove that or try and come in between my role as a father with my girls' relationship to this land, the territory, their family systems on both sides of their family, and that's just the way it is, and I'm gonna invest time and do that, and, like, raising healthy daughters, ideally, yeah, that's the goal, is to raise the next generation of people who are gonna carry the nation forward. Like, that's what we did as a people, and that's what we have to do, right? That's why governance is, like, in disarray today, is because, yeah, like, going back to the fundamental frame you said, is like, we're these leaders moss bag babies. Like, it's funny to think about, but it's practical, because it's like, what influenced them to be like the leader they are today? What happened in their childhood? What happened in their teenage years and adulthood? Because we got just like tons of random dudes deciding to run for chief and council, and they're correct,
Yeah.
and it's crazy, and it's like, for whatever reason, like, decide like, well, I'm gonna man up and be a chief today, and it doesn't
Yeah.
work. It's like, man, like, we have to really go back to the fundamentals of our home fires, like our family systems, and start to even curate and raise the type of leaders we want to see in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yes. Yes, exactly. I just and that's the part where it's like, it almost does get hopeless. It's so easy to just ignore that and just focus on our own families, but you do think about that. You do think about, it's what drives my own work and continuing on, sharing with what little that I know, but also, when it comes to my own community of Long Plain right now, um, always I am always in this battle of like, do I just keep pushing? Do
Mhm,
I just leave it be and focus on my girls? But also I think of, what about my great grandchildren? What happens when they come back here? If they should come back here, or if they are, a part of this community, what are they gonna see that, my own family has attributed to the survival of their culture, language, their tradition, their, kinship systems. Because, as a granddaughter to my Kushi and especially my uncles, the late Curtis and Ferlin Assiniboine, so they were
mhm,
really impactful to revitalizing not only the Dakota language, but, something as simple as powwow in the, 1950s, 1960s, and 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 learning and stepping out into that space like that. There's hardly to none who were doing that at the time, and even we talk about that in the workshop, and my uncles and the creations of their songs were literally sometimes made at the table with my kushi because they didn't speak Dakota, but they sang a lot of their all of their songs were sung in the language,
mhm.
and it came from her,
Wow.
her interpretations, and so my mom had shared with me that in their earlier years of creating songs, they actually got asked about, why they were singing their songs in that way because it was coming from a woman's dialect. And they said because, we work on these songs with our mom and she's obviously female. And so they
Mhm,
had to start reaching out to places like Sioux Valley, Chinoopa Wakpa nations to kind of get that male interpretation to
mhm,
learn the male dialect of speaking Dakota. And so that in itself, like, ties into, that almost like that it's like responsibility to continue on, all of what my own family, like the Assiniboine family, has attributed to the survival of the language and culture from a Dakota aspect in Long Plain right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's badass. I like that. Like, that's a really cool reference and story for you to have and to make reference to is that, your uncles were learning from your Kushi who was a female speaker. Like, that's just the fundamental reality of a lot of our communities is that there is these ties and connections we have that stem directly, like, from the coffee table or from,
Mhm.
the couch in the living room or literally the fire outside. Like, these spaces are where I feel like I really wanna start reminding people of because we are in a time where people are moving to the big cities or they're moving to these big career paths, working for industry. And for me, like I don't want to come across as like somebody who's just like I don't know, like a cultural radical of like we need strong families in our communities, but we do. Like we need to
Yeah.
we need to focus on the fundamentals of who we are as a people. And it was in those shared collective spaces of like literally like traditionally it was our home fires in our lodge. And now it's like, well, where are those spaces? Where is the collective consciousness of our people? Well, it's not on TikTok. It's not on
Mhm.
Facebook, it's not on the influencer in New York saying she's from when she has no connection there, right? That's the reality of it for me. And why are those people speaking for us and trying to lead us down this path of I don't know, whatever recognition they want? And it's causing so much damage to like the young people and the families and the people who are staying put in the spaces and places where the work needs to happen. Um,
Mhm.
and people aren't going to see that on TikTok. Like they're not going to see it on Facebook per se, or or any kind of social media. It happens in the spaces and places. And when you're in it, you're in it. Like you're from
Mhm.
there, observe it, you experience it. And again, it's like this conversation ideally is for Indigenous people who are navigating these things. It's not for, the pretendian trying to pretend or the settler trying to get a sense or knowing. It's for our people. Like we have to
Mhm.
focus on our spaces and places.
Yes, and that also too, like, just reminded me of the drive of, I talked about in the beginning of this responsibility, but this calling, and literally that question of, if you don't step into it, then somebody else will, and it might be, done with ill intentions or
Mhm.
wanting to become TikTok famous or all of these pieces,
Yeah.
than to just do it, and then it's like recognizing that, if you don't do it, somebody else will. And maybe not it might not be done in a good way. And part of that, like, has been the drive of like everything. Like it's so tough to go into community and continuously like my goal is to like be this good relative. And I think of my someone like my Kushi, but even also like your grandma as well. And like
Mm.
your Kushi as well is that there was this sense of like continuously being kind even when people weren't kind to them,
Mhm.
right? Like this energy or this essence of like being a good relative.
Yeah.
I say this in terms of like just researching historically. I've yet to come across Nehiao specifically, so Cree photographs of like children in important places. So there's been some photographs from I think a lot of them came from Morley,
Yeah.
but also, down south, I don't know which nation specifically, but, like, the one from Morley, the picture, there was chiefs meeting the queen, and it's really hard to see in the picture, but in the midst of it, there's one of the chiefs, like, has their young child with them holding their hand, but you have to really look hard for it, like, you can't it's not something that sticks out, and I'm like, it's literal to none that, that I find other than Oceti Shakoi peoples bringing their children into, like, really important places like that.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I don't know if this child was someone that they were nurturing to become a leader one day. Like, I don't know the history of who that was, but Tom I actually, shared that with Tom Snow, who works at Grant MacEwan University, but he didn't even recognize that, like, he's like, "Wow, this is so amazing because it comes from, like, his nation," and
Yeah.
so asking those questions and he has, like, super beautiful stories that he shared,
Mhm.
in terms of their cradle board and the history that they have, but it was so cool to see, like, that piece on, like, how did we bring our children along, but
Mhm.
even those historical photos that was one that really I remembered because they were meeting the queen and the chiefs actually have one
Yeah.
child with them, but you can't see it unless you look.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. And yeah, I did talk to some other Nakotas, and I appreciate you bringing up like my Kushi Mary writer from Carry the Kettle because I'm half Dakota. You're putting me on the spot here with radical narrative because I'm really like positioning myself because I don't think a lot of my listeners who are not Indigenous know like the extent of my Indigenous kinship systems. But yeah, I'm half
Yeah.
Dakota and my Kushi Mary. And you got to meet her, like you got to interact with her and meet
Yeah,
her. So that's
yeah,
pretty cool. You were even close to my late father. You took life skills coach training, right? From my
yeah.
mom and dad, actually, right? My dad was in group with you. So yeah, kind of exposing my family secrets here on the air, but I don't mind at all. Um, and it's valid, like it's a valid observation too, because my Kuko and my Kushi did have, and I'm starting to interpret it in my frame, my lifetime, like where I'm at as like turning 40, as like there's this like dignity we have as a people that we have to maintain around our morals, our belief systems, and our values, and not to compromise those. And I
Yeah.
really witnessed that in my Kuko, my Kushi here, who I grew up with here on Palmaker from, and was from Care the Kettle, is that there's this like innate, inherent dignity, and I feel like you're speaking to that. That we do have this compassionate, kind way of living as a people. And I was just talking to another friend too, who was saying that Ocheti Shakoi definitely have like a lot of fundamental practices around children, young adulthood, and things like that. And I know Cree do also because my late father did share a lot of that knowledge and stuff too. But one of the big things too with the Morley photos, I don't know who the photographer was, but they did have, I gotta think about it. I think his last name was McClintock, who took photos in southern Alberta. And
Mhm,
those photos are amazing. Walter
mhm.
McClintock. And he has glass slides, and people could go look at him, but he has really vibrant photos of predominantly Blackfoot camps, Blackfoot communities. I think he may have took some from Morley, but like he has family system photos, which are so cool to see. Whereas up here in Cree territory, we didn't really have good photographers way
No,
back
and,
when.
like, I'm working with our cultural center right now in Long
Yeah.
Plain, so I'm the wellness coordinator, but we actually, like, we our goal is to eventually try and find artifacts that were from Long Plain, and a lot of them are down in, like, New York,
Mm,
and the reason behind that was shared with us is that the expectation was that there was gonna be no Long Plain at one point, so what's the
mm,
point in leaving it with them? So they took them back in order to in hopes to have, like, artifacts from a nation that once was. So
mm,
that was kind of the goal of it, so we have yet to, like, see what that looks like. I hope to make it down there and to see what they have in terms of our own nation, and I don't know, like, if that's I know you guys have, like, a historical site right in your
mhm.
community, but, like, I wonder.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting project to take on, and, because, yeah, there are there's stuff out there, there's, story out there. The only thing that I think, like, we have on Palmaker is, like we talked about in a few episodes back, or the last episode with my cousin Aaron, is that this ethnography, and then some of the interviews in there are really embellished. But yeah, not much photos. There are some photos I found of Cree families, but you could definitely tell the photographer was like saying "sit there, stand there" type
Yeah.
approach. It wasn't like a natural state of a family system. So I'm really skeptical of those photos too. And yeah, it's like something that that's an interesting conversation. And yeah, I do believe like I think Morley has that one famous photo of the family smiling.
Yeah, I seen
Yeah.
that one, yes.
Yeah, where there's the father, mother, they're sitting there and there's a baby smiling, which means they wanted their photo taken, right? There was a good relationship with the photographer there, whereas some of ours is just like, yeah, we definitely didn't want our photo taken by somebody that day, it looks like,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes. So I hope to, the intentions and the go to from here is that, to learn to get in contact with people who are willing to connect and share, the
Yeah,
teachings because we don't have anywhere to go and ask. I've been asking.
yeah,
But also like to see historically what they look like. And I know like the Smithsonian has a lot of those pieces and there's some new pieces being
mhm.
created by artists as well. But it would be interesting to see what that looks like.
Yeah, valid, valid. That's a cool project, I like it, and even, like yeah, I know, like, well, my daughter's being half Comanche and Kiowa. They have cradle boards and, people maintain the practice there. My girl's mom knows quite a bit of stuff and knows how to
Yeah.
make them too, but, again, like, you're doing the project where you're taking it out there to community and showing people, which is cool. Yeah, some closing questions I wanted to ask you, like, what are some ways from your experience parents or, well, even like caregivers, right? Because we do have a lot of caregivers now who may not be the children's actual parent, but how could they reconnect like with like the traditional practices in general around like the cradle board approach or even powwows in general? Like what advice do you give people? Because I know we do critique. Well, I do personally, I wouldn't say critique. I know I'm pretty could come across as very harsh towards somebody who's not from a community. But again, like for
Mhm.
me, it's like I'm always going to welcome somebody who's from my community, and they always have a like a home fire to come home to when they're ready. How do we explain to people? Like, how do you explain to people for somebody who wants to reconnect in a way that isn't through TikTok or social media or, being a career like Indian, where it's like now they're appointed as being native from that community without actually any like real ties?
That's, one of the biggest questions, and I think for many of us, for many of, the families looking to reconnect, it's you need to be in those spaces. You talked about, you have to be in that collective. You have to be, in where are you investing your time and energy in
Hmm.
terms of wanting to learn something. And so, sharing just this past week with Kihiwan was that, you guys get this beautiful one day of creating a cradle board. However, this also comes from how many, weekends, weeks, days, we've spent in community willing to learn this
Hmm.
skill to come and share with you. Had we just went on TikTok and just started watching videos, that energy probably wouldn't be there. And so I think that, if they were going to want to reconnect, it's about getting out there. It's about creating the connections. It's about being in the spaces of powwow. And for every, not so healthy person you meet, there's probably two or three who are waiting to, be open
Hmm.
and to share with you in a good way. But also with our ceremonies and our places of, um, prayer, wherever the whatever that looks like for us, you'll find where you need to go and to always, be intentful of what you're doing. But I think that the biggest thing is to just get out there and to be in community and to allow, your children or yourself to experience it and to talk and to get to know, the community and so that like pushes me and I'm like, hey, we're making the effort to go, to Kihiwin, to Niganit, to carry the kettle, where my partner's from. And also
Hmm.
like when we can, we're here in Long Plain, to take our girls into those spaces so that when they grow up, they'll be able to go into these communities and people are going to know, which family they come from and,
Hmm.
who their parents are, who their grandparents are. And I think that that's also really important because you think of somebody coming back into a community and they say, like, first question, right? Like, well, who are you? Okay, well, who's your parents? If you don't know them, well, who's your grandparents? And you kind of know then and then you're like, "Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, you're," and then you'll kinda go into that piece on how you relate to them is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. Showing up, right? Like it boils down to literally like showing up. Yeah, and like in my work too, like we have conversations with family systems and with people who are, even like estranged from family systems and drama, trauma, chaos there for sure. But fundamentally, like the people who navigate those toxicities do so with the effort of wanting to rebuild a healthy family, and it requires showing
Mhm.
up. Like, it literally requires, like,
Yeah.
like, fundamentally just going to the birthday parties, making the drive out there, sitting with people, and if you're out on the land or in the territory, like, middle of nowhere, rural Saskatchewan, it could be boring. It's gonna kinda be boring, probably gonna get your shoes dirty.
Yep.
Probably maybe sleeping on in an uncomfortable bed, maybe overcrowded in some cases. But again, for me, like if we symbolically just look at the fact that these are where our home fires are, then we have to be in those spaces where our family is. And for some of us, we get what we get, and that we got what we got, and that's our family. So we have to be willing to at least improve it, and first and foremost, show up to it. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and, the goal is always to like, I'm bringing it back to your kushi and my kushi, but also, like, once you mention there's certain people, like as soon as they hear or they'll know, "Oh, I knew how did you know, Rose Assiniboine?"
Yeah,
And I'm like, "Oh, that was my kushi." Oh, and then, that instantaneous, like, gratification of, like, the legacy literally of just their name and being
yeah,
related to, and I know that's probably, the work that, your kushi did as well, because I know,
for sure.
they speak very highly and respectfully of your kushi out in Carry the Kettle, and
Mhm.
so, like, that legacy too, and, like, reminding ourselves to show up as good relatives, as healthy
Yeah,
relatives, especially for those, coming behind us, and
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I did a workshop for Care the Kettle last year, I think, and, a lot of family were there, and, yeah, they knew I was Mary's grandson, and it felt literally like I was with family, like,
Yes.
I literally with family, so I was working and presenting to my family, and I was, going over some of my modules and things I was working on, and they liked it, like, they really loved it and, enjoyed it, and yeah, I got to, like, work with my family and the band, the department paid me to go do that, but it was like, man, like, I should have been paying you guys because I got to sit with my family for, like, a day and talk story and share information, and it was really, like, a core fundamental connection of, like,
Yes.
being with my relations from there, and, my late Kushi always used to say, like, "You gotta know who your relatives are." Like, that's
Mhm.
step 1, know who you're related to, and I'm actively working on that with, like, the family tree and genealogy of my daughters and me on both sides of their family, right? And, realizing that there's a lot of relationships out there that we have to maintain and do our best to maintain.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Any closing questions or comments, Emery? Because we covered a lot and it was a good conversation. Yeah.
Um, well, first off, I just wanna say, pirama yeah, for having me on the podcast. Again, like, this work that I do is so close to my heart, and I feel like it's even in this podcast, like, it's not about sharing everything. It's about, skimming the surface on a lot of what can be shared,
Yeah.
when we cross paths with each other, or, if anybody's listening, if we are crossing paths, like, to have those conversations. And I think that, like we said, it's about showing up and holding space for those conversations to happen. And so I just want to say thank you for, listening today and letting me share a little bit of the hard work
Mhm.
that, is currently being outputted through my family right now in 2026. Like, oh my goodness, you would have asked me like 10 years ago to be to do, what I'm doing today. I'm like, what the heck? Like, you're crazy, you're wild. Like, you met me when I was like 19, 20, and how,
Mhm.
quiet and shy, and this it's just come such a long way in terms
Yeah.
of, the growth that I've
Sure.
personally witnessed through the work of, your mom and dad, and how it's been so at the center of all that, came after
Mhm.
doing that internal work, and allowed me to show up. Like, I literally feel like I'm 35, and I feel like I'm finally who I am, and kinda getting to know who I am, like, at 35 years old. Like, I hope it's
Mhm.
a lot sooner for my own daughters, that they find out who they are, and who that let them it's almost like letting yourself truly be seen and truly come out and to be who you are. And
Yeah.
so I just wanna thank you as well for opening up the space to have this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah, well, thanks for making time, and like I said, you've been pretty busy the past few years and raising a family, working, professional career. You're back in the community, you're doing a lot of community work now, even around Cradle board, so it's really hard to, like I think we've been
I
talking for,
know.
like, 4 months, 5 months of trying to set something up here, but I finally
Yes.
got you on, and, I really appreciate it. I know my listeners will really enjoy this conversation. Yeah, it was awesome, it was amazing, and yeah, this is like you're the perfect radical narrative guest because we're looking for those people who are on the ground. Like there's no doubt about it in terms of who you are and where you're from and the work you're doing. And that's what I like to tap into. And I like how you said that we're not divulging too much, right? Because we are in the age of like AI and surveillance and
Yeah, yeah.
pretendians who will jack our shit, and use it for their own personal gain. So I appreciate that. And I feel like we did have good conversations. Any shout outs you want to give? I know you gave some shout outs to some other cradle board makers, people who are doing work in that area. I want to give a shout out to the Gustafsons out east because I know that
Yes.
they made my daughter's cradle board, both of them, and unfortunately we did lose them in a house fire. My mom did order those as gifts for us, and I may even put the request in for like a remake, taking a photo and
Yeah,
asking for a
me too.
remake of them. And then the other one that comes to mind too, local from Sweetgrass, Lacey Albert has been doing moss bags for a number
Yes.
of years. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so they are also too, sometimes the Nehiyao communities want to, know where to make those style of cradle boards. So we'll shout out, Ryan and Shannon and the work that they're doing. Also another one is, Darlene Auger. So she had done her PhD on swing therapy, so she
Mhm.
literally does swing. It's like the traditional style swing of how we do with our babies, but
Mhm.
in an adult form. So it's
Mm.
really cool. I've experienced it once. It was a
Nice.
super cool experience.
Yeah.
That's about all, but I'd also like to shout out my children, Wacheke Assiniboine and Wowicheke Assiniboine,
Mhm.
just in that, I hope, my goal and hope is that, we shift a little bit so that they have a little bit less to move through
It's
when
awesome.
they're raising their children, should they decide to.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's amazing. I was talking with a friend who has a podcast in the US, and we were having conversations about how, man, like if the world doesn't collapse, like digital media and these podcasts will be out there forever. Like we're literally creating like a historical record. And that's how I
Yes.
approach my episodes and why I really strive for quality with the content because this is the snapshot of our time and era. So your children will listen to this episode in the future. They're going to hear our voices at the age we're at. My daughters are going to listen to these episodes eventually, maybe even after I'm gone and they'll exist out there. So it's like we're literally doing the work for our children to stand on and continue doing the work in their lifetimes, right? So yeah, that's cool you
Yeah.
did that shout out. They're going to hear this one day and maybe they'll
Yeah.
be old in olden age dancing and they'll be like, "Hey, I listened to your episode finally." But yeah.
Yeah. Or they just won't even ever, and they'll just do something completely different, which
It
is
Yeah,
okay, I
that's
guess.
true too. Yeah, that's a big parenting conversation because I don't know, like for me, being in academia, like I jokingly say, like, well, I don't even jokingly say, I sincerely say, like, I hope my daughters like have a career path where it's not like doing the same thing we're doing today.
Yeah.
Where we did gain some ground, some like nationhood discourse and stuff to be who they want to be. Because I feel like I was just thrusted into like Indigenous governance work out of necessity. Like, oh man, we're losing on this front, so we got to have some more voices and conversations. But I'm
Yeah.
down for whatever they want to do. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, exactly. And that was one of the things, we have so many people sharing the struggles with their communities, and I'm like always bringing it back to like, well, what is the answer? How do we shift all of that? We get educated and we get into those spaces and places and be that shift and change.
Hmm.
There could be so many issues with CFS, but what happens if we have like 50,000 Indigenous social workers? Like, will things change? Like, we don't know unless we try.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, valid. Yeah, we could talk about a lot of stuff because I know there's some questions I didn't even get to ask, and I think we didn't even answer most of the questions. I think we only technically answered like 3 of the questions, but the conversations are all valid, on point with the theme of what we wanted to achieve. So thanks, Emery.
Yes, beautiful.
Awesome, cool. Well, we'll be in touch. Thanks for making time, and have a good day.
All right, Doshta.